6:15 was supposed to be the 1 hour of the day. Nothing could touch me. The office was empty at that hour, the way I liked it. Fluorescent light, flat and colorless, humming down over rows of government gray cubicles that nobody had bothered to personalize in 11 years. Somewhere near the break room, the ancient coffee machine groaned through its cycle, hissing and spitting, the only warm sound in a building constructed entirely out of cold ones. I am Elena Reyes Whitfield. For 11 years I have been a contract auditor for the Defense Contract Management Agency, and before that, 6 years in Army Logistics, a Kuwait rotation, the kind of job nobody puts on a recruiting poster. I read numbers for a living. Numbers don't lie to you. People do. That distinction has kept me sane through a decade of other people's mistakes. That morning a number lied to me anyway. The system flagged a procurement contract at 6.9 M medical equipment, cardiac monitoring units, destined for a Veterans Affairs clinic outside Richmond. A routine flag, the kind I clear 4 or 5 times a week without a second thought. I opened it out of habit more than suspicion, coffee still cooling untouched at my elbow. Then I saw the authorization signature. Mine. My pulse climbed into my throat half a second before my mind caught up to why. I hadn't signed anything in 11 days. I have a rule about signatures: I never sign at the end of a week, when I'm tired, when a mistake is more likely. I sat very still and stared at the little digital timestamp sitting under my own name like it belonged there, like it hadn't been placed there by someone else's hand while I was somewhere else entirely. I did what I always do when something doesn't add up. I didn't call anyone. I didn't panic, and I didn't feel the urge to. I opened a blank spreadsheet and started a new tab, the cursors blinking in the corner of an otherwise empty document, waiting for me to give the problem a name. I named it Discrepancy Do Not Delete, 96 hours. That was the contract's approval window before the funds released to the vendor automatically. No second signature required, no flag raised twice. After that, whatever happened next would happen with my name already locked to it, whether I found the truth in time or not. I didn't know yet that the address on that contract, a VA clinic in Richmond, was the same clinic where my father had a hospital bed 3 floors up from the cardiology wing. I didn't know that yet. I would by lunchtime, and by then the number on my screen would have stopped being an anomaly and started being personal. "That's not my signature," I said quietly. To no one, to the empty cubicle, to the hum of the lights. "That's my file." I closed the laptop lid halfway, just enough to think, and I let the coffee go cold. People who meet me outside of work assume auditing is a passive job, that I simply confirm what other people have already decided is true. They're wrong. Every signature is a small claim about reality. Every claim can be checked against another claim, and another, until either the whole structure holds or it doesn't. I have spent 11 years learning exactly how many small claims it takes before a structure that looks solid on the surface starts to come apart in your hands. That morning, sitting alone under fluorescent light with cold coffee at my elbow, I didn't yet know how many claims this particular structure was built on. I only knew that the first one was false, and it wore my name. Dinner that night was at the main house. My husband's family never called it the main house out loud, but everyone at that table understood the phrase and what it implied about the rest of us. Gerald Whitfield sat at the head of a table long enough to land a small aircraft on, a bottle of something French breathing beside his elbow, the clink of forks against Limoges china keeping perfect, expensive time with the conversation. I sat where I always sat, not at the corner, past the corner. The overflow seat, my father-in-law liked to joke, reserved for the in-house bookkeeper, as though 11 years of federal auditing work were a hobby he was humoring me through. Elena's still doing her little audits, Gerald said to a guest across the table, not to me, smiling the particular smile of a man who has already decided the joke is funny before anyone else has weighed in. Numbers all day. Fascinating life she's chosen. A ripple of polite laughter moved down the table. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting a piece of chicken I had no intention of finishing. 11 hours ago, someone had signed my name to a $140,000 equipment order, and I still didn't know who or why, and this man's laughter filled the room like the wine filled the glasses, warm, easy. Entitled to every inch of space it took up without asking permission from anyone in it. Marcus, my husband, didn't laugh. He looked down at his own plate, jaw tight in a way I hadn't seen from him in months. That was new. I filed it, Elena, Gerald added, refilling his glass without offering the bottle to me. Whatever you're digging through at the office, leave the company contracts alone. That's not your department, and it's certainly not your business. He said it lightly, the way he said everything. But his hand found his phone on the table and turned it face down before he'd finished the sentence, a small controlling reflex. I filed, without comment, the way I filed everything. I hadn't mentioned the contract. Not to him, not even to Marcus, sitting 18 inches to my left. I set my fork down very deliberately, the small click of metal against porcelain the only sound I made. I file numbers, I said. Flat. Even. Quiet enough that only the immediate table caught it, but clear enough that no one at that table could pretend they hadn't. I don't invent them. Nobody answered that directly. Gerald's smile held one beat too long before he turned back to his guest, moving the conversation forward as though nothing had happened, as men like him are trained to do from birth. I watched Marcus's hand tighten around his fork until his knuckles went pale against the silver, and I filed that too, the way I file everything, without comment, without confrontation, for later use. Gerald hadn't asked what I was digging through. He'd told me to stop. Which meant he already knew there was something worth stopping, and that was the second false estimate of the day I intended to check against the record. I drove to the VA clinic the next morning before work, the way I did most Tuesdays, to sit with my father for 20 minutes before his vitals check. Frank Reyes, staff sergeant, retired, 3 tours between 2 wars, a heart that had been patched, wired, and monitored more times than either of us cared to count out loud. The room smelled the way VA rooms always smell, antiseptic, laid thin over something older and harder to name underneath it. His cardiac monitor beeped in its steady, sedated rhythm, a sound I'd learned to find almost comforting over the past 2 years, proof that the machine was doing its job. My father's hand, when I took it, felt thinner than it had even a month ago, but it still carried that permanent, low-grade tremor of a man who'd spent 30 years around vibration and blast concussion and never quite left it behind. A nurse came in to check his monitor readout and stopped mid-motion. She peeled a small manufacturer recall sticker off the back of her clipboard and pressed it flat against the side of his defibrillator unit, muttering something under her breath. "Recall notice," she said, mostly to herself, not to me. "Second one this batch this month." I didn't move for a full second. Then I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, for the serial number printed along the unit's housing. She read it off without thinking twice, the way you'd read a number to anyone. I typed it into my phone under the edge of the bed rail, my thumb steady even though nothing else behind my ribs was. It matched. Exactly. The same batch number sitting inside the flagged contract still open on my laptop at home. "Who's the supplier on this equipment lot?" I asked, keeping my voice light, keeping my face doing nothing at all. The nurse checked her clipboard again, flipping a page. "Whitfield Industries. Same folks who handle half our equipment contracts region-wide. Good outfit from what I hear." I looked at my father's monitor. At his chest rising and falling, steady, powered by a machine that someone in my husband's family had apparently signed off on, using my name, without my knowledge. Without a single conversation with the woman whose signature now sat on the paperwork. "Same serial number," I said quietly, to the machine, to my father, to the version of myself that still wanted this to be a clerical accident. "Same signature, not mine." My father squeezed my hand once, the way he used to when I was 7 years old and something in the house had gone wrong that he couldn't fix from where he sat. He didn't ask what was wrong. He never did. He just held on a little tighter, and I let him for exactly as long as I could afford to before the 20 minutes ran out and the next patient's family was waiting in the hall. He'd taught me, without ever framing it as a lesson, that the army doesn't run on courage so much as it runs on paperwork, done correctly the first time supply manifests that match what actually arrives. Maintenance logs that don't get backdated to cover a missed inspection. He used to say a unit that lies to its own logbook eventually kills someone with the truth it never wrote down. I hadn't thought about that phrase in years. Standing in that recall-stickered room, I thought about it the entire drive to work. I didn't confront anyone that night. I went home to the house I still, at that point, believed was mine, made tea I never drank, and sat down at my laptop at 11:40, the house dark around me and rain starting against the window in that slow, deliberate way that means it intends to keep going for hours, maybe all night. My first thought was Marcus. He had access to my badge number for building sign-ins, and he'd been strange at dinner in a way that had nothing to do with wine. I checked his login history first, half hoping to find nothing and half already rehearsing what I'd say if I did. His credentials hadn't touched the system in 6 weeks. Whoever this was, it wasn't him. I widened the search instead of narrowing it, the way I'd been trained to when the obvious answer turned out to be wrong. I pulled the access logs on my digital signature credential, cross-referencing them against my own calendar, my own badge-in records, my own physical location for every hour of the previous 2 weeks. 3 failed login attempts from my own terminal, at a time I was 2 floors away in a compliance meeting with witnesses. 1 successful login 4 minutes later from a laptop registered to the company network, a laptop assigned to Diane. My sister-in-law. I sat with that for a long moment, the cursor blinking, the rain picking up outside. Diane had never once been unkind to me in 9 years of marriage into this family. If anything, she was the only Whitfield who had ever looked at me like a person worth knowing, rather than a line item to be tolerated at holidays. I didn't call her. I didn't send a message. I opened a second file instead, an audit trail entirely outside the company's own systems, backed up to a physical drive that lived in my glove compartment and nowhere else. Because I had learned a long time ago that anything worth protecting shouldn't live only in a place someone else controls. Rain kept coming down outside, steady and indifferent, the kind of sound that makes a house feel smaller than its square footage, makes a marriage feel like something happening in a different building entirely. I don't confront, I said out loud, to the empty kitchen, to the dark window, to nobody. I document. I worked until almost 2 a.m, building the file line by line, refusing to let a single entry go in without a timestamp and a source. When I finally shut the laptop, I had 11 pages. 11 pages, and 1 name sitting at the center of the first 8 of them, circled twice in a program that doesn't technically support circling anything. Diane Whitfield Ashford. I didn't know yet whether she was the one who had betrayed me, or simply the one who had been used the same way I had a tool someone else had picked up without asking. I intended to find out quietly, carefully, the same way I found out everything in this life that had ever mattered, one verified document at a time, never faster than the evidence could support. By then the 96 hours were already gone. The system had auto-approved the funds on schedule, exactly as designed, without waiting to see whether I'd caught up to my own name. Whatever this was, it hadn't needed my signature to be believed only to exist. That told me more than a delay ever could have. Nobody expected me to look this closely, this fast or at all. I met Diane 3 days later at a coffee shop, 3 blocks from my office, the kind of place with a grinder loud enough to cover any conversation you didn't want carried past your own small table. I didn't accuse her when she sat down. I've learned across a decade of audits that accusations close doors patients can still open. I need to ask you something, I said, and I need you to just answer it. No performance. Just the answer. Diane's hands were wrapped so tightly around her paper cup that the sides had already started to buckle inward, the lid ticking softly against her thumb. She didn't ask what I meant. Something in her face told me she'd been waiting for this conversation since the day it happened. I logged in as you, she said, before I'd even finished my sentence, the words coming out fast, like she'd rehearsed them and needed to get through them before she lost her nerve. Dad told me it was routine, a backlog signature, nothing more, something to keep a shipment from missing its window. I didn't know what was actually in the file. I swear to you, Elena, I didn't know. Do you know now? She looked toward the door, then back at me, and something in her expression folded inward, the way paper folds when it's been wet and dried too many times. There's a hidden drive, shared server, but locked under a folder nobody's supposed to open without clearance from my father directly. I've seen the folder name. I've never opened it. I've been too afraid to. Why not? Because my daughter's college trust is controlled by my father, she said, quiet enough that I had to lean across the small table to catch it over the grinder's noise. If I open that folder and it's what I think it is, he'll cut her off before he ever cuts himself off. That's how he's always operated. Family is leverage before it's family. I didn't tell her it was going to be fine. I don't make promises I haven't audited first, and I wasn't about to start with the one person in this family who had just handed me something real. I signed, she said finally, looking down at the wreckage of her coffee cup. I didn't choose to. That was the sentence I needed. Not a confession exactly a hinge. A place where the door could still swing either way, depending on what came next. I thanked her, and I meant it fully, and I left without ordering anything for myself, because coffee has never once helped me think clearly, and that afternoon I needed to think more clearly than I ever had. Diane and I had married into the same family 8 months apart, two outsiders absorbed into a name that predated both of us by 3 generations. In the early years, we'd developed the kind of quiet alliance people build when they recognize the same posture of survival in someone else, the careful way she deferred to her father in public, and the careful way I deferred to mine. Both of us fluent in a language of small, strategic silences. I had never asked her to choose a side before. Walking back to my car that afternoon, I understood that I just had, whether I'd meant to phrase it that way or not, and that some decisions don't announce themselves as decisions until they're already halfway made. I accessed the shared server from my own home office 2 nights later. Using credentials Diane had quietly left unlocked for exactly 1 hour, on exactly one evening, without either of us ever discussing the arrangement directly out loud. The server room she'd described sat 3 floors and 1 firewall away from where I was physically sitting, but the sound of it, steady, mechanical, indifferent to what it stored, seemed to fill my small office anyway, in my imagination if nowhere else. Fans turning, cooling towers cycling, the low electrical hum of information nobody in that family was ever supposed to see from the outside. I found the folder. Locked behind a second layer of encryption I hadn't expected, something well beyond the casual carelessness I'd assumed I was dealing with a password gate that 11 years of federal compliance training hadn't fully prepared me to break on my own. Inside what I could still reach, though, was enough to change the shape of everything. An internal email chain, half visible even through the partial access, referencing repackaged units, and a line that stopped my breathing for a second. Do not delay past Q3 VA contract timeline is fixed. Find another way to move the flagged inventory. Someone inside that company had known the equipment was compromised, and someone had decided the deadline mattered more than whoever ended up wearing that equipment against their chest. My phone buzzed once on the desk beside me, unknown number. A single text, no name attached, no context needed. Stop looking before your son loses his mother. I sat with that message longer than I sat with anything else that entire week. not because it frightened me the way it was clearly meant to. Because it told me something far more useful than fear ever could. Someone already knew I was looking, which meant I was closer than I thought. "Someone knows I'm looking," I said out loud, mostly to hear it spoken in a voice steadier than the one currently running through my own head. I didn't delete the message. I photographed the screen, time-stamped it against 3 independent sources, and added it, calmly, to a file that was growing heavier by the day. I also did something I hadn't planned on doing that night. I pulled the shipping manifests for the last 4 VA contracts Whitfield Industries had fulfilled, cross-referencing delivery dates against the internal image timeline. 2 more clinics appeared in the pattern, one in Norfolk, one in a small facility outside Roanoke. Neither had issued a public recall yet. I didn't know how many patients that meant, and I made a point of not letting myself guess a number I couldn't yet verify. Guessing wasn't useful. Verifying was. I added both clinics to the file and kept working until the message on my phone had gone from the most frightening thing in the room to simply one more line item among many. Marcus made his decision 3 days later, on a night I will never fully stop replaying no matter how many years pass between now and then. I came home to find the porch light off and the front door already unlocked from the inside, which was its own kind of message before a single word was exchanged. Through the front window I could see warmth I wasn't part of anymore, candlelight flickering against the walls. The outline of a woman who wasn't me sitting comfortably in my chair, laughter carrying faintly through the glass. A bottle of something dark being poured into 2 glasses that clinked together, like nothing in that house had changed at all, like I had simply never existed inside those walls to begin with. My suitcase was already outside on the front steps. Packed, not by me, zipped by someone else's hands, in someone else's order, my life folded into someone else's idea of what I still needed. Rain had started while I was still driving, and it hadn't let up since. It came down cold and steady, running off the gutter above the door in a thin, constant line that pooled directly onto the canvas of my suitcase, soaking through within minutes, darkening the fabric from the top down. Marcus opened the door only far enough to speak through the gap, one hand still braced against the frame like he expected me to push past him. "I've filed for emergency custody," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You're not stable enough for Ethan right now. My father's lawyers agree, and the paperwork's already moving." I stood on the steps, already soaked through to the skin, and pulled out my phone instead of raising my voice. One photographed the suitcase on the wet stone, water beading on the canvas, time-stamped before I ever touched the handle. I did not ask him how, after 9 years, he could do this to me in the space of one wet Tuesday night. I looked past him instead at the warm light spilling out around his shoulder, at a life continuing comfortably without me in it, and I picked up my suitcase, water running down my arm as I lifted it. "Keep the house," I said. "I'll keep the evidence." He shut the door without another word. I heard the lock turn from the inside. I stood there another moment, rain running down the back of my collar and pooling cold against my spine. And then I walked to my car, because standing in the cold proving a point to a closed door has never once solved a single problem in my life. And I am not, and have never been, in the business of gestures. I am in the business of documentation, and documentation doesn't require an audience. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I turned the key, rain drumming against the roof in a rhythm too steady to be anything but ordinary weather, even though nothing about that night felt ordinary. I thought about Ethan asleep upstairs in that house, 2 floors, above or didn't know was happening, and I thought about the version of myself that might have knocked on that door, might have raised her voice, might have given Marcus exactly the scene his father's lawyers were hoping to photograph. I didn't do any of that. I drove to a motel 11 minutes away, hung my wet clothes over the shower rod, and opened my laptop on the bed to keep working, because the file didn't stop needing me just because the house did. The psychological evaluation took place 4 days later, in an office the Whitfield family had quietly funded for years without ever saying so. On any invoice, a lavender diffuser humming softly in the corner, soft gray chairs arranged at a careful, therapeutic angle, the kind of manufactured calm that costs considerably more than it should, and buys considerably less trust than it's designed to. Dr. Owen Marsh reviewed my file with hands that would not quite stay still against the folder in his lap. The concern, he said, not meeting my eyes for more than a second at a time, is a documented pattern of erratic behavior. Withdrawal from the family unit, paranoid ideation regarding, he checked his as though he needed reminding of his own conclusion, corporate conspiracies involving your extended family. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, spine straight, the exact posture I'd learned in basic training long before I ever learned how to build a spreadsheet. "Doctor," I said evenly, "who signed your consult fee?" He didn't answer that directly. His pen stopped moving for a second longer than it should have, and something crossed his face, not fear exactly, closer to the look of a man watching a door he already knows leads somewhere he doesn't want to walk through, but is walking through anyway because someone above him has made the decision for him. Custody hearing, 10 days out. That was the only number that mattered to me now, more than the diagnosis, more than the folder, more than the lavender smell I'd carry out of that office on my clothes for the rest of the day. I recorded the entire session on my phone, resting flat and silent in my jacket pocket. One-party consent, my home state, entirely legal, and I said nothing about it out loud, because the truth has never once needed an announcement in order to matter. It only needs a record that survives longer than the memory of the room it was spoken in. I watched Dr. Marsh's hand one more time as he closed his folder. At the end of the session, the same tremor as before, the same posture of a man performing an assignment he hadn't wanted, handed to him by someone he was more afraid of than he was of me. Before I left, Dr. Marsh walked me to the door himself, which wasn't standard practice for that office. At the threshold, he said quietly, almost too quiet for the hallway to catch it. "For what it's worth, nothing in your file reads the way they described it to me beforehand." I didn't answer him. I only nodded once, filed the sentence the way I file everything, and walked out past the lavender diffuser into a parking lot that smelled, blessedly, like nothing at all. I didn't know yet that I'd be sitting across from that same folder again, in exactly 10 days, on a very different side of a very different table. Rosa Delgado's garage smelled like cold engine oil and old carpet. 3 mismatched monitors balanced on a workbench she'd built herself out of surplus lumber and stubbornness. We'd served together in Kuwait. She ran signals intelligence. I ran procurement audits, and Zamard, a supply depot with no working air conditioning and a generator that failed twice a week. We'd decided, without ever saying so directly, that we trusted each other permanently and unconditionally. "You understand what you're asking me to do here is federal," she said, not looking up from the middle screen, fingers moving fast across a keyboard missing 2 of its keycaps. "The moment we're inside that folder, there's no version of tonight where we didn't look. That door only opens one way. I understand." She worked in silence for a long stretch, the blue light from the monitors the only thing moving in the otherwise still garage. Then she leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, studying the screen like it had personally offended her. "There's an offshore account structure buried under 3 separate shell entities. It only becomes visible, legally visible, traceable in a courtroom the moment somebody actively moves money through it. Which means we don't get a slow, careful reveal. We get exactly one window, and it opens and closes in the same breath. When does it open? Whenever they're moving something live. A signing ceremony. A wire transfer tied to an active contract." She turned in her chair to face me fully, her expression sharpening. "If we go in early, they patch the hole overnight, and we lose everything we've built. If we wait for something big enough that they can't quietly walk it back, They can't hide it, I said, finishing the thought for her. Rosa nodded once, slow and certain, one window, one shot. No warning shot before it. I thought about the custody hearing sitting 10 days out on my calendar. I thought about Gerald's board meeting, the multi-billion-dollar defense contract he'd been bragging about at 3 separate dinners over the past month, the one he kept calling closing any day now, like a man rehearsing a line for an audience. The 2 dates, when I checked them against each other that night, at Rosa's kitchen table, sat 9 days apart. The custody hearing came first, which meant I would have to walk into that courtroom with nothing solid in hand and trust completely in a window that hadn't opened yet, might not open in time, might not open at all. You know I'll be watching that account structure every hour between now and whenever it moves, Rosa said, closing her laptop for the night. You don't have to carry both clocks in your head. Carry the one in the courtroom. I've got the one in the boardroom. It wasn't the first time she'd offered to carry something of mine without being asked twice. In Kuwait, she'd covered 2 of my shifts during a week I couldn't explain, no questions, no ledger kept between us. I'd learned a long time ago that the debts that matter most are the ones neither person bothers to count. I nodded, gathered my folder of printed logs, and drove home through empty streets, already rehearsing, without meaning to, the exact sentence I would need to say out loud if the window opened at the worst possible moment. The call came at 11 at night, from a number I recognized instantly. Dr. Marsh, standing somewhere with wind noise behind him, a hospital parking lot, judging by the faint sound of an ambulance bay door cycling in the background, his voice thinner than it had been in his office. Stripped of whatever professional calm he usually wore like a uniform. I can't sign what they asked me to sign, he said, the words coming fast, almost tumbling over each other. Not in good conscience. Not anymore. I've been carrying this for a week and I can't carry it any further. What changed? A long pause, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. I have a daughter, he finally said. 7 years old. I keep thinking about what it would mean if someone did to her what I just did to you and your son. Put it in writing, I said, keeping my own voice level, refusing to let relief creep into it before the paperwork existed. Notarized. Tonight if you can manage it. Tomorrow morning at the absolute latest. He agreed, and I heard something in his voice loosen slightly on the other end of the line, the particular sound of a man setting down a weight he'd never wanted to pick up in the first place. I didn't know, until 2 days later, that Gerald's people had been quietly monitoring parts of my phone activity, nothing sophisticated, nothing that would survive a real forensic challenge. Just a paranoid man throwing money at a paranoid solution, the way he threw money at everything else. He didn't get the content of that call, he got the fact of it. A call, at night, longer than 3 minutes, placed to a number his own legal team had flagged as connected to his hired evaluator. That fact alone was enough to make Gerald panic in his own quiet, controlled way. 2 days later, without explanation, my custody hearing was moved up on the docket. 3 full days earlier than originally scheduled. Before the board meeting, before Rosa's window had any chance of opening. Priya called me the moment the new date posted to the court system, her voice carrying the particular tightness of a lawyer recalculating a strategy in real time. They're trying to force your hand before you have anything to play, she said. Which tells me they're more worried about what you have than what they're showing the judge. I sat with that assessment for a long moment after we hung up. Fear, in my experience, is rarely random. It usually has a shape, and that shape usually points directly at whatever the frightened party is trying hardest to protect. Diane found me the night before the hearing, in the small stone chapel 2 blocks from her house where she told me once, years ago, she went whenever she needed a room that didn't belong to her father in any legal or emotional sense. She held out a small folded slip of paper without a word at first. On it, a string of characters, the second layer password to the hidden folder, the one piece Rosa still needed to finish what we'd started weeks earlier. "If this doesn't work," Diane said, her voice barely above the sound of the candles flickering along the wall, "I lose my daughter's trust fund. Maybe I lose more than that if my father decides to make it personal the way he usually does. I know what it costs you. I'm not doing this because I think you're going to win," she said, finally looking up and meeting my eyes directly for the first time that night. "I'm doing it because I already know exactly what happens to all of us if nobody does anything at all. I've watched that outcome my whole life. I'm done watching it." I took the paper from her hand, folding it once more before slipping it into my coat pocket. I didn't thank her with words. Some things aren't improved by saying them out loud in a room built for silence. I simply held her gaze a second longer than felt comfortable. Men like him kept strange things, the way you do with someone you've just watched make a decision that will cost them something significant no matter which way the rest of the story breaks. "I'm done being their signature," she said quietly, and turned back toward the candlelight, leaving me standing near the door with everything I needed, and 9 days no longer standing between me and any of it. Every piece was in place now. The only thing left was timing, and timing was no longer mine to control. It belonged in the end to 2 separate clocks, a courtroom clock and a boardroom clock, ticking down at 2 very different speeds toward the exact same morning. The family courtroom was cold in the particular deliberate way. Federal buildings are always cold, recycled air moving through vents with no interest in comfort, hard fluorescent light with no shadow left in it. An architecture built entirely around efficiency rather than mercy. Gerald sat beside his 2 attorneys, wearing the expression of a man who has already mentally moved on to his lunch reservation. His attorney entered the fabricated psychological evaluation an earlier draft, unfortunately for him, and not the recantation doctor. Marsh had since sworn to under oath into the record as Exhibit 4. The judge reviewed it with the flat, practiced efficiency of a man who sees 100 custody disputes a year and has long since learned not to linger emotionally on any single one of them. Based on the evaluation currently before me, the judge said, glancing once at the clock on the far wall, "I'm inclined to grant temporary primary custody to the paternal grandfather, pending further review in 90 days. Gerald did not smile outright. He allowed something close to it instead, the particular quiet satisfaction of a man watching a plan complete itself precisely on schedule, exactly as he'd designed it to. My attorney's phone buzzed once against the wooden table, screen facing down. A single word from Rosa, visible for half a second before the screen dimmed again. Window. 3 floors away, in a boardroom I would never personally set foot in, a 9-figure defense contract was being signed at that exact moment, under bright lights. In front of 2 trade photographers, documenting the occasion for a press release that would never be printed. Beside me, my attorney, a quiet, methodical woman named Priya Nanda Kumar, who had taken my case pro bono after reading 11 pages of my own documentation and deciding, in her words, that someone finally brought me a case I don't have to build. From nothing kept her eyes forward, waiting for a signal we'd rehearsed twice the night before, but never fully believed we'd need to use under this much pressure. I stood, chair scraping softly against the tile. "Your Honor," I said. "May I show one document?" Whitfield Defense Holdings boardroom sat 3 floors above a lobby paneled in the kind of dark, polished wood that photographs well for annual reports and investor packets. Gerald stood at the head of the long table, pen already moving across a signature line, cameras from 2 trade publications recording the moment for what would have been, under any other circumstances, a very good week for the company. Somewhere behind that moving pen, in an offshore account structure buried 3 shells deep, Rosa's access request went live. The instant Gerald's signature touched the paper, timed to the second the way she'd promised it would be. The corporate card reader at the catering station near the back of the room rejected a routine charge. A small thing. Nobody in the room noticed at first, too caught up in the ceremony of the moment. Then the boardroom's presentation screen meant to display a celebratory slide, marking the signing flickered once, twice, and rewrote itself entirely. Serial numbers filled the screen, dozens of them, then more than dozens. Matched, line by line, against Veterans Affairs Clinic hospital records pulled from a public compliance database. A defibrillator unit, model and batch number, cross-referenced directly against a Richmond patient file, bearing a name every person in that room would eventually come to recognize: Frank Reyes. Gerald's pen stopped moving entirely. "Technical error," he said to the room. Too quickly, his voice pitched half a register higher than it had been 30 seconds earlier. "I will have this resolved within the hour, I assure everyone." The screen did not resolve itself. It scrolled instead through a wire transfer ledger. 3 shell companies in sequence, 1 final destination account, a dollar figure large enough that 2 board members visibly sat back from the table, chairs creaking against the polished floor. Federal agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service were already positioned in the hallway outside. They had been for 11 minutes, waiting on a legal authorization that had just, at that exact second, turned green on a laptop 3 floors away and 2 miles across town. Rosa's voice came through my attorney's phone in the courtroom, calm and procedural, like she was reading off a checklist rather than ending a man's career. "Freeze the accounts now." In the boardroom, one of the younger board members, a woman who had joined the company only 18 months earlier and had nothing to lose, by asking the obvious question, turned to Gerald with her hands still flat on the table. "Mr. Whitfield, is there a reason patient records from a Richmond VA clinic are displayed on our signing ceremony screen?" Gerald didn't answer her. He was already reaching for his phone, already dialing a lawyer who would not pick up in time, already living, without knowing it yet, in the first 60 seconds of a life that had just permanently changed shape. The hallway outside the boardroom filled with the particular, controlled sound of a federal arrest in progress. No shouting, no struggle, just the flat mechanical click of handcuffs closing and the low, procedural voices of agents reading a man his rights, while his own board members stood frozen along the walls, watching an entire career dismantle itself in real time under fluorescent light that didn't care one way or the other. I wasn't present for that part. I was 3 floors down and 2 miles away, back inside a family courtroom, sliding doctor. Marcia's notarized recantation across the table before the judge had even finished reading the first line of it. "Your Honor," my attorney said, "the psychological evaluation this court relied on for its initial ruling has been formally withdrawn by its own author, under oath on the record, as coerced testimony." The judge read the document twice, slowly, his expression shifting somewhere in the second pass. He looked at me once, briefly. Then he looked toward the courtroom door, where a bailiff had just leaned in to whisper something about federal agents and a company 2 blocks away, making the local news feed in real time. "Custody stands with the mother," he said finally, setting the paper down. "Full custody, effective immediately as of this hearing." I didn't cry in that courtroom. I have never once solved a single problem in my life by crying in front of the people who caused it, and I wasn't going to start there. I simply exhaled, once slowly, the particular release you feel when a door that's been locked for weeks finally, suddenly gives way beneath your hand. Outside in the hallway, Ethan was waiting with my mother, restless in a plastic chair too big for him. He ran to me the way 5-year-olds run, with no sense of the distance, still technically left to cross, and I picked him up and held him the way I hadn't fully allowed myself to in 3 weeks, because I couldn't afford to fall apart before the work in front of me was finished. Priya squeezed my shoulder once on the way out of the courthouse, the closest either of us came to celebrating in public. "You know," she said, "most clients bring me anger." "You brought me a spreadsheet." I told her that was the only weapon I'd ever fully trusted, and she laughed for the first time since we'd met, a real laugh, the kind that only shows up once the worst part is actually over. It was finished now, 3 weeks later, the recall had been fully executed under direct federal supervision. Every defective unit from that contaminated batch had been located, tested, and replaced across every VA facility it had reached, my father's included. I sat beside his bed at the clinic, his new monitor beeping in a steady, healthy rhythm. Nothing at all like the low tremor of uncertainty the old machine had carried, without either of us fully realizing it. "Strong signal, Dad," I said, taking his hand in mine, feeling the familiar tremor that belonged to him and not to any piece of failing equipment. "Steady heart." He looked at the monitor for a long moment, then back at me, and squeezed my hand the exact way he used to when I was small, and the house had finally gone quiet again after a long storm had passed through it. Gerald Whitfield is currently under federal indictment on multiple counts of defense procurement fraud and identity misuse, his bail conditions restricting him from any contact with active government contracts. Marcus and I are no longer married, and Ethan has adjusted better than either of us expected. The way children sometimes do when the adults around them finally stop pretending. Diane called me the week her father's accounts froze. She didn't say thank you, and I didn't expect her to. I kept her. She said her daughter, her trust fund, the whole life she'd been afraid to lose. That was all either of us needed the sentence to do. I still work in an office with fluorescent light and a coffee machine that groans through its cycle every morning at exactly 6:15. I still open a blank spreadsheet whenever something doesn't add up, still name the tab, before I let myself feel anything about what's inside it. Rosa took a formal commendation for the digital forensics work she did off the books, on her own time, using none of her official clearance improperly every step of it. In the end, defensible in daylight. Which was the only way either of us ever intended to do it. Dr. Marsh kept his license. After a review board decided coercion under financial threat mitigated what would otherwise have ended his career, and he sends my father a card every year around the anniversary of the recall, which neither of us has ever mentioned to the other out loud. Most days now it really is just numbers. That's exactly how I like it.